Today marks 1 year since the launch of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we thought it would be a good time to take a look back at some of the highlights, lowlights of this barbaric war. To start us off, here are a few things that you might recall from the last year.
Let those Russians come here, she says. We are ready to greet them.
Firefighters tackling a blaze at a fuel depot in the Russian city of Belgorod. The governor there has accused Ukraine of sending helicopters to attack the oil storage tanks under the cover of darkness.
And the Russian column that has come down here has been absolutely hammered.
Ukraine didn't fall. Ukraine is alive and kicking.
So look, with 1 year of this war, that video could have been roughly a year long at the very least, but that does remind you of a few of the big events, some of the early acts of defiance that felt at the time like the defense of Snake Island as like a last thumb in the eye of the invader before the country falls. The citizenry, like that old woman standing up against them, felt like a last roar of defiance. And then you start to have these events where things start to turn. A few attacks actually going beyond the Ukrainian border that they say they weren't behind, but kind of seems like maybe they were. And all the way up into Vladimir Zelensky's announcement just in the last week that the country has not fallen and hasn't. The war is obviously far from over. For all we know, it'll go on for literally years, but a lot has happened in this year. We're gonna try to jump through a few more of those highlights, but David, what are your thoughts as we hit this anniversary mark?
Well, it was a year ago when some of the nation's most prominent mainstream broadcast journalists, Andrea Mitchell, like at NBC News, she was suggesting Kiev is going to fall within a week. And of course, it did not. And it suggests, well, first of all, the mainstream media, they have their own problems. But I think what was so striking, and so many people in the United States in particular underestimated just how strongly Ukraine was going to fight and how defiant they were going to be in defending their country. And so they have turned this literally, instead of being a Russian romp through Ukraine, they have actually, Ukrainian forces have perhaps evened it out. And Russia doesn't have much more territory than it did a year ago. And the Russians have suffered more than 100,000 casualties, not as many casualties on the Ukrainian side. It is a remarkable turn of events over what a lot of people were anticipating a year ago.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this war can be broken down into a number of different phases, and it has been very difficult at any particular point to reliably predict what those developments are going to be like. I mean, I know many people, a lot of people, including me, didn't think that the war would begin in the first place because it seemed like such a disastrously horrible idea to launch one. I was wrong about the start of the war. I would argue right about the nature of the consequences of the war for, at the very least, the Russian people, if not the oligarchs who nothing can really harm them. But I want to start off with some of one of the initial turning points. So you have the launch of the war. Many people who apparently had years of experience studying the region said that we're talking days before the fall of the government. Kyiv will fall. But that didn't actually happen, and that was the first big turning point. Despite protracted bombardments, Russian forces were unable to gain control of Kyiv. They faced massive logistical challenges with ground forces unable to move fuel, munitions, and material because of clogged roads or attacks against their convoys. I remember reporting on this 40-kilometer long Russian convoy that had stalled and was being picked apart by drones and counterattacks from the Ukrainians. They eventually fully pulled out of that region by the end of the March, close to a year ago, stating that their focus would now be on capturing the eastern Donbas region. And then, of course, evidence of massive war crimes began to come out. Those have been a near constant. Mass graves have been found. Reports of, reprisal killings, rape, effectively allegations of genocide when it comes to the massive systemic moving of populations outside of the country where they actually live. I believe we actually have a little bit of a reminder of what was going on in Bucha. If we could bring up, we have a little bit of B-roll of how horrendous that was. The footage that came out of that initially was one of the first undeniable bits of video of just how terrible the attack and then the retreat of the Russian forces were. Forces from the Ukrainians and journalists coming back in and just finding bodies everywhere. I mean, we had known how terrible this war was to that point. I was actually listening to the first show we did about this earlier today, but it became kind of indisputable how barbaric this thing was once we saw the evidence of these war crimes. What do you think, David?
Yeah, barbaric would be an understatement. And I think maybe, people may not be surprised by, the barbarism on the Russian side or maybe even the Ukrainian side. But I think what is so surprising still, Russia is a superpower. Until a year ago, they had one of the most feared militaries in the world. I'm not sure anybody would have predicted that Russia would have had problems with its supply lines, with its munitions, with its supporting its own troops, with its command and control. And yet it seemed like Russia was fighting this war not as a superpower, but as a country that has a military that was not ready for something like this. And that's just shocking. And yes, a lot of credit to the Ukrainians for the way they've defended themselves and the defiance they put up in the face of such horrible brutality and war crimes. But a lot of this is also Russia's own fault because of how miserable they have been in the execution of this war.
Yeah, and look, I know it's cliche at this point to declare that a war was needless, that it was pointless, but has there been a modern conflict more pointless, more needless from the point of view of the invading nation, like the people of the invading nation? Obviously, Vladimir Putin sees potential, either rhetorical or symbolic gain in this. But if you're like a regular person living in Russia, what the hell has this done for you? Let alone the barbarity.
I almost wonder, General, for some historical connections, right? I mean, Stalin, it cost him 1 million Russian soldiers to try to get to Berlin at the end of World War II before the United States could get there. And there are a lot of historians who say, look, the Russian. The Russian military has sort of a history of just throwing more and more people into a meat grinder to achieve their needs. So, I mean, look, you could say that, well, that's a very anti-Russian thing to say that they don't value the lives of their own soldiers or their own people. But it certainly, there's an argument to be made about that, not just because of historical situations like, the end of World War II, but also what we're seeing now. I mean, it just feels like more and more troops, and now college students are being conscripted in the Russian forces, and they're not prepared to fight, and yet they're just being thrown into the front lines without much concern about the death toll.
Yeah, no, totally. We spent years criticizing the US for not caring nearly enough about the ongoing losses in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we were right to do so. But when it comes to willingly sacrificing forces, it's hard to find a country or a government anyway, more prepared to do that historically than Russia or the Soviet Union before them.